let us get on now with our next panel discussion. We're going to pick up on some themes laid out by Per and by Yannis. So let me just invite to the stage those of our contributors who are here in the flesh. So could I please now be joined by Alberto Arroyo Schnell, by Robert Horster. I think Heske is joining us on the big screen, so we can also welcome Heske Verberg, and Dirk Jacobs also. So if you three gentlemen and Heske on the screen, there she is. So we'll have Alberto here, and then we have Robert and we have Dirk. And let me just introduce them all to you so you know who everybody is. Next to me, we have Alberto Arroyo Schnell. He's head of policy and programs at the International Union for Conservation of Nature at the European office. I guess here in Brussels, Alberto, yeah? We have Robert Horster, who is Global Sustainability Director, and it's quite a mouthful this, but Agricultural Supply Chains and Food Ingredients, and also Head of Environmental Markets at Cargill. Did I get all of your titles?
That's right. That's right.
Good. Excellent. Heske, welcome to you. I don't know if you can hear me properly. Let me just see if you can hear me. Can you hear me, Heske?
Yes, I can hear you properly. I hope you hear me as well.
We hear you loud and clear, and we see you, and it's great that you could join us. Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, Heske is the Managing Director of Solidaridad Europe. That is an NGO working on a sustainable, greener economy. And finally, we're also joined toward the end of this row by Dirk Jacobs, who is Director General of Food Drink Europe. I think that I'm right in saying is the industry group representing food and the food and drink industry. And having looked at their website, they are absolutely committed, they say, to working towards a healthier, greener planet. That's what websites usually say, isn't it? So let's test that out a little bit. Good. So there, ladies and gentlemen, is our panel. What we are really discussing is this whole idea of how we can address the climate emergency, and I think that's what we're calling it, very definitely calling it now a climate emergency, and the biodiversity crisis in the context of this food system transformation that I think everybody agrees is vitally needed. Climate, biodiversity, and food system transformation. Can we make all three priorities at the same time? All of you, I think, have got a few opening remarks you want to give me, a theme you want to just lay out there, and then we're going to have Q&A, which will include questions from our audience. So just because this is the order of you arriving on the stage, Alberto, give me a very brief upsum of your thoughts at the beginning.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you very much for the Forum for the Future of Agriculture for having us here. I am working for the International Union for Conservation of Nature, so you can expect me to speak about nature. And one of the key things that I would like to start with is that we have heard all the time here transformation, transition. I think we can all agree, and that's a good start, that business as usual is not an option. So we have a number of crises to solve. One is the food, and another very important is the biodiversity and climate crisis. All the actors here will need to be part of the future solution, or we are, if you want to put it that way, doomed. So we need to have all of us included into the solution. And I want to include, and I want to start very much emphasizing the farmers here. Yes, we have a number of actually farmers, or sons of farmers, or daughters of farmers here. So that's very helpful. That's what we need to start to think about. And actually, if we think also from the environmental perspective, only farmers are the ones that can also make a change. They are there. They are the stewards of the territory. They are the ones who can make that we achieve also the environmental targets. Now, we have a number of crises at the moment, as I said, and they are related when it comes to the food system with market failures, with food waste, as we know, emerging situations. We have heard about Ukraine a number of times, this terrible situation, but of course also climate and biodiversity. When it comes to climate and biodiversity, it goes in both directions. So we know very well that agriculture depends on a healthy biodiversity and a healthy climate. We know all the issues related with droughts. We know all the issues related with pollinators. We have heard it from Yannis, and the numbers are not going to mention there, but they are terrible in terms of losses that we can have if we don't take care of pollinators. We also know that in the other direction, it also works like that. So at the moment, agriculture is also contributing to both climate change and also to biodiversity loss. The In Europe, it's actually mentioned as the main threat, agriculture, to biodiversity. So, as I was saying, we have a responsibility, all of us. It's not just environmentalists that sometimes we have also the feeling that we have a strong responsibility. We do, but the ones that are there, as I said, are the farmers, are the ones that have to really make the difference.
Do you think things are going in the right direction? I mean, I dare say you've been coming to the FFA for a number of years. I've certainly been coming to it for more than a decade. We have these debates year on year on year. Are you coming back with a greater sense of optimism that things are heading in the right direction or not?
Frankly, not exactly. We are going, well, okay, we are going in the right direction, maybe not enough fast, and maybe not enough also strongly as we should be, ambitious actually. At the moment, the crisis, as it has been mentioned before, both the climate and the biodiversity crisis are still enormous. We cannot say that we are going in the right direction in that sense, if that's a question.
Okay, good. Well, that's a good opening gambit from you. Let's go to Robert. Robert, give us your, again, brief as you can, opening thoughts on this.
First of all, is my microphone working? Because it wasn't. Is it working well?
I think so.
Right,
But
okay, good.
Just bend it so it's very close to your mouth.
There you
and
go.
Then we'll hear you better.
Yeah. Thank you. Because there was some issues in the beginning was being mic'd up. But
Yeah,
it's
I
okay
would
now.
even, if you can, just bend it even more so it's really close
Like
to
it's
your
in
mouth.
my mouth, almost.
Yeah, just bring it right close to your mouth.
Like this.
I think, ladies and
think so,
gentlemen, are
yeah?
you hearing Robert?
Okay. Good.
Yes,
Right.
good.
So when I was thinking about this, and I knew you were going to ask us to make an opening statement, Stephen, I was, yesterday at dinner, I couldn't make the speakers' dinner, but I was drawing a triangle, and that triangle was on the so on the one hand, we need to produce 70% more food by the year 2050. That's an often repeated statistic, but I think it's fair. I mean, I'm not sure if that exact number is right, but substantially more food by the year 2050 to feed between 9 and 10 billion people. So that's on one angle. The other angle is about, if you think about the amount of habitable land, 50% is agriculture, 40-some% is forest and native vegetation that needs to be preserved. And then at the top end, you have what I would say is a need for agriculture, but in fact for the whole system to produce less CO2. Right, so you need to produce more CO2, more food,
Yeah.
with less emissions, whilst preserving nature, and I think that is almost an impossible jigsaw puzzle to solve.
Is it?
I think so, but
So that D for doom is entirely justified then?
but I think but to your question is, are we moving in the right direction? I think the answer is actually yes.
So it's not impossible?
It is
can't
not
be-
impossible, but I said almost impossible, right?
Okay.
Because I think two things are needed. One is clearly the realization that this is what we need to solve for. And when you read and listen and speak, I think that's what generally people agree that needs to be done to solve for the triangle. I do believe that there's a lot of momentum actually today from companies like ourselves, like NGOs, banks, impact investors, governments, you name it. I mean, there's a lot of momentum today around the energy to solve this. And there's also one important recognition, and I think is that there's a need to scale. Because I see a number of initiatives happening out there in the market, a number of initiatives, and we have an opportunity to scale it now with moving sufficient capital towards those solutions. And I think if that happens, we'll be on our way. So
All right.
it is almost impossible,
Almost,
but it is
that
doable.
almost
But
word
it
is
is
doing a
doable.
lot of heavy lifting, and we're clinging
Absolutely.
to it like people sort of clinging to a piece of wood after a shipwreck. So thank you, Robert, for that. I'm going to bring Heske in. Heske, I don't know if I hope you're able to follow the beginnings of this discussion. We need your input now. So just to remind everybody, you're the MD of Solidaridad Europe. Perhaps you can begin by just telling us briefly what Solidaridad does, and then give us your opening thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. And it's such a pity I cannot be there in person, but the developments of the COVID crisis also allow me to travel again. So I'm in Ghana at the moment, in Kumasi, and I will spend my day with farmers, actually, cocoa farmers in the field. But first, thank you. And I'm very well able to follow the discussion, so thank you. And well, I think what we see right now is that I'm happy that it's a no-brainer for everyone that farmers should play a pivotal role in the transformation of our food system. Because we all know they are the stewards of our land, they produce all the food we consume. However, now we depict farmers either as victims, suffering from climate change. That's what I see here in Ghana as well. Extreme weather events, farmers are confronted with degraded soils, water shortages, decreasing yields. But we also depict farmers as perpetrators, contributing to climate change. I'm Dutch, and our farmers are heavily involved in livestock, dairy, meat, and well, it's not a very favorable footprint to say the least. And this is also backed up by statistics because we see that food systems contribute to 34% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. A majority there, 71% of this part, are land-based. So this is also an enormous opportunity because there are several nature-based solutions that can make farming extremely low carbon. Solutions like biochar, but also agroforestry, replacing synthetic with organic fertilizer, better livestock management. We even see in pilots with Solidaridad, because we work in all these international value chains like coffee, cocoa, tropical commodities. So we see in pilots with smallholder farmers of coffee in Colombia that farming can even be net negative. So more carbon is taken out of the atmosphere than greenhouse gases are emitted. So, and the same is likely for other crops. From my perspective, cocoa and tea, for example. So I think it's really time to change the narrative of victims and perpetrators to climate heroes. Farmers should be climate heroes.
Well,
they play an essential role in the transition of our food system.
Yeah, there's lots of people smiling at the notion of farmers as heroes here, Hiske, but are you telling me that farmers can become heroes and you can maximize outputs, you can meet the challenge of the 9 or 10 billion people on the planet that we've just heard about, that there will be no cost to this transition?
That's exactly the point, Stephen. So there is an enormous potential to store carbon in soils and trees of farmers' land. And we have 570 million farmers, and Robert already said, referred to the hectares of farming land, but now we have to start paying for it. So it should be a business case for the farmer to transition to the sustainable practices.
Right, and I guess that leads to a discussion about how much support farmers get, whether farmers are being prioritized, and we will get to that. But Hiske, that's a brilliant opening from you. Thank you very much. You just listen now, because we'll get our fourth panelist to give us his opening thoughts. So that's Dirk. I'll remind everybody, Dirk, you are the Director General of Food Drink Europe. You give us your perspective.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the organizers for inviting me here. Food Drink Europe is the representative body of the European food and drink industry. We represent approximately 290,000 companies, 99% of which are small and medium-sized. And I think that's also an important point to make, because a lot of these companies are already sort of facing hardship, particularly today when we're having to deal with what I call the 4 C's of crisis. The COVID pandemic that we're still in today, the conflict of war in Ukraine, climate change, not to forget, and bringing that all together into also cost in terms of food price inflation, energy price inflation, and that's the kind of pressure that we have to deal with. Our industry buys approximately 70% of what Europe's farmers produce. And that's why there is a big interlinkage and also a big responsibility, therefore, to make sure that our food systems become more sustainable. And we believe that can be done, but we have to be mindful that there are only 8 harvests until 2030, when we are supposed to meet the 55% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in the EU. So for that, you need to have stability in business. So in the relations that the companies have with their suppliers, with the farmers, with the primary producers, you need to build in a de-risking of the transition. You need to address the volatility that will only increase over time, and also incentivize farmers. And there are a lot of good activities that are ongoing right now by individual companies. But as my colleague said, this needs to be scaled up. We need to find common metrics, common standards and definitions. And that's where policymakers also have a role to play in the coming time. What I would hope is that we can find a way to create better governance where we come together, because it feels like we're speaking different languages today, and we're not doing the matchmaking that is needed to bring all the parties around the table and really make those concrete steps. Because otherwise we will, unfortunately, have to say we will not meet those deadlines that are very urgent.
Well, that raises a question, and now, thank you very much for that, and now we're into a open debate. Raises the question of what role regulation plays in all of this, as opposed to voluntary codes of conduct, because the EU has codes of conduct for responsible food business. It has the idea that, if it lays out guidelines, people will meet them. But is there now a moment, you say, this is pressing, this is urgent, this is an emergency. Is there a time to say, guidelines and codes of conduct are not enough, that the EU, as we're talking in Europe, the EU is going to need to get much tougher in terms of regulation, demanding transparency, accountability, and enforcement as well? Is that time now?
Well, I think the industry is certainly an asking partner for regulation that helps to create the policy and enablers. I see that there are a lot of companies that really want to accelerate their actions, but that can't, because they are held back by certain lack of infrastructure or lack of authorization of certain innovations. So we do need regulation, but it has to be concerted. And I think regulators are generally good in regulating. That's their task. But you also need to have the co-ownership, the buy-in of those that have to do the real work on the ground. So that's also where a code of conduct can play a role in setting that common vision, that common pathway, and to the point that was made before, also to reshape the narrative around it. This should be a positive thing, something that we can bring everyone along with in that journey, which is not going to be easy, but which also deserves some support and some pride as well in helping to move towards sustainable food systems.
Right. And again, maybe this is for Alberto or for Heske. Are farmers really being sort of put at the center of this debate, or do you fear that they are sort of being assumed that they will change their practices, but they're not being given enough encouragement, the system isn't being created where farmers are actively buying into this?
Well, farmers are doing a lot of good things at the moment. Let's also remember that. There is sustainable agriculture happening at the moment. Simply much more needs to happen. Before, when you were asking me, are we going in the right direction? And I said, no. Well, what I mean is mainly more about the speed, if you want. We need, as everybody's saying here, by the way, a transformation change. And it was very interesting what Per was saying about smoking, that it had to happen through a regulation, and in that moment, 3 years ahead. That was also interesting, right after the elections. But that was the way that things really changed. Well, maybe that's what's needed. I don't know, I'm maybe thinking a little bit higher here, but it's very interesting to see that maybe if we need such a change, that the regulators are the crucial here, as we know, maybe that's what needs to happen. And anyway, there is already a common agricultural policy. It's the biggest budget of the European Union. So there is possibilities to do things there. And let's remember that part of this common agricultural policy is used for subsidizing unsustainable practices, which is not what we want. So we can redirect that to the transition. That's probably a way forward that we can explore. And in that moment, no doubt, in this moment, we are putting the farmers at the center. The only policy that we have for agriculture at the moment is focusing on production, which, by the way, is another thing that we should focus on. The rest of the value chain is not only production. As we have all these actors here, this is very important to also focus on the rest. And at the moment, the policy is only focusing on production.
Yeah. I just want to hear from you again, Heske, on this question of farmers, whether they, their role in the global food supply chain is properly recognize whether they're getting the support they need, and particularly, you know, obviously when we talk farmers, we're talking from the most massive, large-scale farming, industrialized farming operations to smallholders, and what's your perspective on the support being offered at different levels of the farm production system?
Yes, Stephen, that's a very good question, because I think at this moment it's absolutely insufficient, the support that farmers get. We have 570 million farmers worldwide. 500 million of those farmers are smallholder farmers. Those farmers live under very difficult circumstances. A lot of them live below poverty lines. So, and this is also where these European policies come in. It's really about time to move from individual company policies or industry action based on voluntary sustainability standards to an effective, smart mix of measures at European level. It's time for strong guidance from the European Union as a market director, and I'm very happy that they are doing this attempt and that they are stepping up.
Isn't the Green
Because
New
from a
Deal supposed to be all about that?
Exactly, and it's not only about Europe itself, but it's also about the footprint of Europe. So outside Europe, all these commodities we are importing to the European market. But what we see now is that we have this due diligence in place, for example, but that we do not take sufficiently into account the situation of those smallholder farmers on the ground. Because we can have very nice requirements. So we should say, like, okay, farmers, you should comply to these European rules and regulations. You should produce in a more sustainable way. But imagine you are a smallholder farmer. You live below the poverty line. There's much more support needed to ensure that it's truly a business case for this farmer, that this farmer is paid for the ecosystem services he or she is providing. And this is something what needs to get more attention also from European policymakers.
We had Yanis talk a little bit about the Ukraine crisis, the war in Ukraine and the impacts it might have. And I don't want to get too stuck on Ukraine, tragic, of course, though it is. I don't want to, obviously this isn't really the forum to get into the war itself, but there is a context here, and that is that we already see a real spike in food prices globally. There is an inflation surge across the world. This war, one of the impacts it's going to have is exacerbating that inflation surge, and particularly when it comes to food prices, because as we've already said, that Ukraine and Russia between them represent a huge part of the wheat production. They also represent, in terms of Russia, a huge contribution to fertilizers worldwide, and the inflation spike is going to be a big one. When you consider that, there are some saying it's a little bit like the impact it could have on energy, where people are going to say, you know what, we have to backpedal a little bit. We have to go slow on our transition to renewables, to green energy, because in the short run, we now need to actually focus on drilling for oil in the North Sea, or fracking, or shale oil and gas, because we need to wean ourselves off Russian energy, and the only short-term way of doing it is to expand our fossil fuel production elsewhere. Could there be an analogy in food production that because we see this looming inflation challenge coming, we will just say, you know what, for now we just have to maximize production. Even if it doesn't fit with the green transition, we've just got to maximize production right now for short-term reasons. Is that a problem any of you panelists foresee?
I think, you know, it's a very interesting question, and it's super complex, Stephen. So this is not to evade the question, but so first of all, I think the direct answer to your question is we should still work within the boundaries that we've set, which is, you know, we need to protect native vegetation. You need to work with the farmers and increase production, and so the food that we must remain on the journey to create a resilient food system.
Do you think the politicians will be saying just that, or might they be feeling other pressures which might deprioritize?
Well, my biggest fear is exactly that. My biggest fear is that we now deprioritize sustainable development in order to solve other things first. But the interesting thing is, as if you double down on creating a resilient food system, you are going to achieve exactly what we need, which is more sustainable, more food, because you know, for instance, through regenerative agriculture, you increase the yield with the same amount of land. And if you think about the triangle that I was talking about in the beginning, it is exactly that point. So you don't touch native vegetation, you increase your production, and at the same time, if you do it regeneratively, you also reduce the carbon footprint. So it's a triple whammy. But you have to double down on it. You don't lose focus. And I think one of the speakers before me said that you have to stay on course. This is the moment, I think. Yeah. And working with the farmers is critical for that, right? Because they hold the key.
Dirk, I can see you want to...
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think, of course, the natural reaction, and I can understand that in terms of crisis, or in times of crisis, is that like we need to readjust, and we need to hold, and we need to stop. But it would be short-sighted, because the sustainability of food systems can only be resilient if they are sustainable. And that requires sort of sticking to the objectives that we have set out. Maybe seeing where some recalibration might be needed, because we have to acknowledge that we are in a different context, and we will be in a different context in the long term. This is not just going to go away in a few months' time, whether we like it or not. So we need to recalibrate our perhaps some of the details of the Farm to Fork strategy or the Green Deal, but not to lose sight of the end objectives of what the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork try to achieve. I think we have to have an open conversation about that, and really looking at what are the impacts and how can we make sure that we build in sort of the necessary tools and the necessary incentives to make that acceleration by 2030 in particular. Because otherwise we'll delay and we'll lose time, whereas we do not have that luxury.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's always the danger when politics and strategic objectives mix, that short-termism becomes dominant. But listen, I've had a fair old chunk of time asking my great panel some questions. Now it's your turn. We've got 15 minutes or so left, and I do want to make sure that hands go up and that people get to ask questions on the floor. Also, I want to make sure that everybody watching online, and I know there are 100 people watching online, they get an opportunity to put questions through the FFA platform. We've got one already from Michael Hamill, so I'm going to start with you, Michael, as you put your question forward. Could the panel direct itself to the keynote speaker's point? I think this is Per's point earlier, where he was saying, he was focusing on what changes behavior with regard to food production and consumption. How do we get to change behaviors when it comes to production and consumption? So who wants to pick up?
I can come in there, Stephen.
Sorry, Heske, say again?
I can come in there.
Yeah, good. Go on then.
Thank you. Well, I think there is something very important which can change behavior, and that's money. So money talks. So we need rules, we need regulations, but we should put the money where our mouth is. So we have to start paying for these ecosystem services. We have to pay a fair price for the carbon credits that farmers are storing in their soils and their trees. So that's the strongest driver for behavioral change.
Now that money's got to come from somewhere. Where does it come from? Does it come from consumers who have to pay higher prices?
It can come from consumers, but there's quite an unequal value distribution in global value chains. So I think all market actors should contribute. So it's consumers, it's the private sector companies.
And how does that go down with consumers at a time, as I've just alluded to, of raging inflation in everything from energy to supermarket food prices? You then tell consumers that they've got to pay substantially more for their food on top of every other inflationary pressure, because we need to give farmers a much greater incentive to produce environmentally friendlily, if there is such a word.
Well, it's not that much more, Stephen. So if you look at what a farmer gets from tropical commodities in the value chain, it's only 5 to 7% of the price that consumers pay in the supermarket. So if you say like, okay, you would like to reward farmers for their ecosystem services, it's only a few percentages that maybe should pay more. And part of that will be paid by other actors like retailers who have big margins in value chains. So I think we shouldn't worry too much maybe about consumers at this point of time, but look for other actors in the value chain to take up those costs.
Yeah, a point well made. And Dirk, you need to respond to that. You guys, with your fat profit margins, are...
Ooh la la. That's a bit of an overstatement, I'd say.
Well, I don't know. And when comparing how you sort of reap rewards from the food chain compared with the smallholder farmers that Heske is most concerned about, I don't think it is unfair.
No, I think that there are a lot of cost pressures throughout the chain. They start with the smallholder farmers, and then they go all the way up. And we, as the middle part of the chain, are equally affected.
Well, you were very keen to tell me about the small retail element within your membership, but actually you also represent the giants who make vast corporate profits, so let's not forget that.
Yeah, but also they are having hard times, imagine it or not. But this is, like, the pressures that we're facing today are unprecedented. And there's somehow a way that we need to deal with that pressure. And that's, on the one hand, that is looking at how can we work together to make our yields better at farm level. How can we help farmers to reduce costs by, for instance, implementing regenerative practices, having better longer-term contracts with farmers to provide that stability, to de-risk that transition, and therefore also bringing down the cost, working in more circular ways to bring down costs in the system. And then, of course, if you want to take into account the externalities in terms of climate, in terms of environment, in terms of health, there is inevitably a part that needs to be transmitted back up until the consumer. We're paying a lot of money on our iPhones and technology, but maybe we also should collectively, and I mean citizens, start thinking about, do we find food valuable or not? And if so, we need to put the right price to it.
Well, that's an interesting point. I'm not sure people would feel that because food's important to them, they want to pay much more for it, particularly in the current climate, but you're suggesting they may have to, I guess. Go on, Alberto. And then I'm going to come to you, sir, who had your hand up, so yeah, keep it up and I'll be with you.
Just because what I was saying before, I think is quite important. There is already money there. It's not enough. I can agree also with what was said before. But there is already a number of possibilities that can be used better. And let's remember also that 80% of the direct payments at the moment are going to 20% of the farm. It has to do with the size of the farm, of course, but it has to do also with what do we want to do with the future. And this probably will need to change if we want to have a future that is different. And also, just a quick point about what was mentioned before. It is very important also to remember that the healthy diets are very similar to the sustainable diets. So actually going in the direction of health that I think we can relate much more with is going to be very helpful for the environment also.
Yeah, but then the perennial question is how you best persuade people to embrace the healthy diet, which is also the sustainable diet.
My point is that it might be more difficult to convince them about environmental issues than for health issues.
Right. Yeah, good point. Sir, where was that hand? Yes.
Thank you. I'm Luc Bos, and I'm now with the European Environment Agency. I was with IUCN before, and it's even more from that history that I'm back here and seeing that Alberto is on stage discussing these very important issues with the farming community, which is super. But my question goes to the worry about who is going to pay what and where and when and how. And that was now the discussion, but why not look at an overall efficiency or looking at the food waste? I haven't heard that much about the enormous amount of food waste that could be avoided, which is to the benefit of consumer and producer. Why not having concrete proposals for making the supply chain shorter or the value chain shorter? It's way too long now. So there's a lot of waste down the road that
Yeah.
could be avoided and which would benefit both in biodiversity, nature, and the farmer.
Of course.
Why don't we really discuss that to the bottom?
Yeah, maybe it's not the sexiest part of this whole debate, but it's a hugely important one. And it's been around for years, and yet nobody really seems to properly address it. Why is this?
I think it's not. First of all, I think it's very difficult to understand how big the food waste actually is, right? I mean,
Well,
it's-
how big? Can you put a percentage sort of framework on it? Or-
I've heard between. So what I'm hearing is between 15 and 25%.
Yeah, it's
gets
shocking.
wasted, right? That's shocking.
It's
That's
what a
absolutely
completely
shocking.
ridiculous situation we're in.
It is but it's along the entire chain. It's from the moment it gets harvested,
Exactly.
from the moment it gets harvested to the dinner table, right? And so I think a portion of the waste that we could actually try to avoid is through capacity building in the origins. If you think about the farmer harvesting the crops, putting them in storage, transporting them to a silo, then the silo goes to ship and so on and so forth. There's already a big part wasted there through ingestion, water ingress and rodents and what have you. It's as basic as that. And so investing in infrastructure is going to help a lot already. And then on the other side, I think the point of education of consumers, I think there is something to gain there too, right? In terms of what gets wasted at the dinner table, but it is an enormous amount.
But again, none of us would disagree. We need to cut the waste out. It's just over years and years, the debates continue, and it doesn't seem to happen. So how? Aren't we learning anything about what works and what doesn't in terms of drastically cutting down on this waste, which is so desperately inefficient on every level and so negative for the planet?
Negative for the planet. So to Heske's point about money speaks, maybe you tax it.
Okay, so let money
Yeah,
speak.
and also maybe I would like to add there. Sorry.
Yeah, go on, Heske.
Because it's not that simple, because most waste is what was mentioned at the beginning of the supply chain. So it's also about logistics. It's about the availability of cooling facilities. It's about the availability of enough labor to get the crops off the field or to pick the mangoes from the trees. So it's not a very easy solution to say like, okay, we fixed the waste problem at the beginning of supply chains, because then you need electricity in remote areas to have cooling facilities. You need good infrastructure to be able to bring this food and vegetables to a marketplace. So yes, there certainly should be attention for this issue, which is rightly pointed out by the guy in the public who asked this question, but it's not simple.
All right. I'd love more questions. So, right, we've got hands up. Ma'am, you've got the microphone, so you're primed. Go for it.
Yeah, thank you. Harriet Bradley from the Institute for European Environmental Policy. I wanted to also just come back to this question around, markets and prices and the current situation, which is also kind of a longer term one as well that's been building up. We've talked about increasing supply, which a lot of people are talking about, but obviously we know that in Europe and across the world, this is coming at a huge environmental cost. The other way that you also, impact on prices is demand-side measures, and we're talking about this. There's discussion about this on the energy side, but on the food side as well. There's a lot of pressure and demand from agricultural commodities coming from things like biofuels, also, the demand for animal feed. Most of the land in Europe is being used to grow animal feed rather than for direct human consumption. So isn't it time to also be having that conversation about demand-side measures in order to avoid that we just simply increase the costs for the environment? And just the final thing on that is linked is the whole fertilizer debate. The signals now, the market signals to farmers are going to be using less fertilizers, which is what the Farm to Fork strategy wanted to do anyway. So isn't the time now to use things like policies and the upcoming CAP funds to actually help farmers to use nutrients more efficiently, etc., so we can actually move on that trajectory that the Farm to Fork was already foreseeing?
Yeah. focus on the demand side. Are you all up for that? You're all nodding wisely, yes?
Yes, actually, if I may, there is an upcoming sustainable food system framework legislation from the Commission that can tackle food waste, can tackle consumer preferences, diets, awareness of consumers. Probably it will not be perfect, but there is an opportunity. And finally, anyway, there is a way to start to tackle beyond the producer side from the European level. And that's maybe an opportunity, special to the European Commission.
I mean, it's an interesting point that, you know, we talk about all the different ramifications of the Ukraine war, and one will be a spike in fertilizer prices, and that may not be a bad thing, and that farmers will be encouraged to find different ways to maximize yields without just chucking more and more fertilizer onto the soil. May be good, but what about other ways in which we can change the demand side? For example, you know, the constant discussion about how we encourage consumers to eat less meat. You know, where do we go with that? How do we really wean ourselves off meat, for example?
I will come back to what I said before about the health.
Yeah, I know, but we've all had the health messaging for years, but we're still eating meat, aren't we?
Yeah, that
Many
was
of us.
Very interesting what Per was saying about the psychological challenges in that, but I think that actually they can be also overcome, at least if we are aware of them. So probably that's the direction, at least one of them. Any
other thoughts on that?
Well, it becomes behavioral, right? And so that's right. This is clearly the point that was made before. So I think at the end of the day, if you follow the reasoning that we've been following for the last 10 minutes about pricing, reflecting the right price for the food may be an incentive to actually to steer, maybe a way to steer demand. Yeah,
follow the money.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as you follow that economic principle, that might actually work as well.
All right, we've got time for at least one more if we're quick. Yes, sir, you've got the mic.
Yeah, Carsten Meyer, the Livestock and Meat Trade Union, UECBB. I may ask, as you already spoke about the meat, as follows. The Green Deal and the Farm to Fork, that's what we stand for, and I may add, it's wire factory. And Dirk, you already mentioned the background. We do discuss, let's say, a balanced diet, but don't we need a balanced augmentation? We have 50% of the emissions is natural. The other 50% we have to talk about. There it's 80% the energy and it's transport. So what we are responsible for and what we stand for is the rest. And the code of conduct was one of the main steps. It's not only the money, but the idea. So may I ask Dirk what next steps we should go? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think the beauty of the work that of the EU Code of Conduct, which was a voluntary initiative under the Farm to Fork strategy, was that it brought together a variety of stakeholders from farm to fork, but also in different parts of the food system, together on a common ambition. And we set 7 aspirational objectives for the food system, how the European food chain should deliver on food system transformation by 2030. And the process in itself has been interesting because it was really the first time that European actors in food were coming together and were formulating what they could agree with and what they couldn't agree with. And actually 99% of the stuff that we discussed was agreeable by those that were involved. And it was also with the European Commission, with international organizations like the FAO, OECD, and so forth. I think the path towards food sustainability should be inclusive. And the discussion about should we eat less meat, should we eat more of this or less of that, should revolve around trying to incentivize every category and every actor to make that shift. So also in the meat sector, I think, and the livestock sector, there can be steps taken. And then on the demand side, to the point that was made before, there are some measures that can be taken, but you need to leave the consumer also some freedom to choose what they want to eat. And environmental considerations can be one, health considerations. It can also be cultural, and we haven't been really talking about the social, cultural role of food as well. So I think it's very complex to narrow it, or very easy to narrow it down to very simplistic conversations. And I think that's what we have to be careful for when we're going to go into this discussion on a legislative framework.
Well, thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, we're pretty much out of time, but I've picked up some very interesting sort of thoughts from this, that following the money always matters. Money is key to so much of this, but also you're suggesting that, you know, codes of conduct can matter. Per's talking about nudges and the psychology of behaviors and understanding what works and what doesn't. And it isn't always just about regulation and lawmaking. It's about a more sophisticated and nuanced approach. So I've picked up a lot of different strands from this conversation. And that's sort of me saying that the red light is flashing, which means we're out of time for this particular panel discussion. It's a shame we didn't have Frans Timmermans as well, but as you know, he's got COVID, so that wasn't possible. But nonetheless, I think we've had a fascinating opening, a really great discussion. So I'm going to thank Alberto, Robert, Heske on the screen. We can still see you, Heske, and thank you so much for your contribution. Dirk, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your patience and your questions.